Namibia may be the only place on Earth where silence feels almost tangible. What do you feel when you stand among red dunes shaped over thousands of years? When you hear the wind whisper through ghost towns slowly buried in sand? Or when you witness the moment the Atlantic Ocean meets one of the oldest deserts on Earth? Welcome back to NexraTV. Today, we're not just traveling. We're searching for moments of stillness that feel almost unreal. In Namibia, a place much of the world has yet to truly reach. Dedvlei sits like a pale basin within the Namib Desert, where silence feels close enough to measure. Here, sand and sky do most of the talking. In Dedvlei, Namib National Park, Namibia, a short walk from the dunes brings you into a floor of sun-baked clay. The light sharpens every edge, and even footsteps sound temporary. Nearby at Sossusvlei, rare floods sometimes spread across the desert, but this pan stays dry, sealed by heat and time. What once flowed in from the Salchab River no longer reaches it. The surrounding dunes, built by wind over countless seasons, hold shades of rust, apricot, and deep orange depending on the hour. Morning air can feel cool, yet the surface underfoot quickly turns warm. From Sesrium Canyon, carved by water in a harsher rhythm, the scale of the park becomes easier to grasp. Namibia's desert landscapes show their history without needing words. Most distinctive are the blackened camel thorn trees, long dead yet still standing, scattered across the white clay pan like ink on paper. Their branches cast thin, precise shadows that hardly move. Dune 7 sits just inland of the Atlantic coast, a broad sweep of sand shaped by the same winds that brush Namibia's shoreline. Its name is simple, but the landscape around it is anything but. Here at Dune 7, Walvis Bay, Namibia, the Namib Desert meets maritime air, and mornings can feel cool even when the sand is already warming. Fine grains collect in clean curves, then scatter again with the next gust. Closer to Walvis Bay, the lagoon and saltworks draw flamingos and other shorebirds, small moving points against pale water and flats. From the dune's crest, the coastal plain can look like a map: straight roads, distant rooftops, and a thin line of ocean haze. People come for the climb, pacing themselves up the windward side where footprints quickly soften and fade. And at the top, the view opens across sand fields and low gravel stretches that continue toward the heart of the Namib Desert region. Even in midday light, the dune's color shifts: ochre where it's dry, deeper where grains pack tight, and almost white where wind has skimmed the surface smooth. Silence here isn't absolute, but it's close, broken mainly by breath and wind. What stays with you most is the steep, loose face of sand, sliding in small avalanches with every step, always reshaping itself into the same clean slope. Sossusvlei sits at the end of the Tsautsab River, where sand and sky meet in long, quiet lines. In Sossusvlei, Namib Desert National Park, Namibia, the dunes carry a deep rust color that shifts subtly from dawn to late morning. Wind redraws their ridges overnight, so the landscape never looks quite the same twice. From the Cesarium Gate, the park road follows dry riverbeds and gravel plains, with oryx and springbok sometimes pausing near the verge. In the distance, the Naukluft Mountains add a cool grey edge to the heat-hazed horizon. Near Deadvlei, a short walk leads onto a white clay floor scattered with dark, dead camelthorn trees, preserved by aridity rather than decay. The stillness here feels physical, like a held breath. Travel is straightforward if you plan for distances. Most visitors base themselves around Cesarium, where guest houses and lodges are easy to arrange ahead. Getting connected is simple too. Local SIMs work reliably, and Wi-Fi is common at accommodations. Even in a desert, water leaves its signature, arriving rarely and briefly after inland rains. Sossusvlei's most distinctive feature is its flat, salt and clay pan, a pale basin that only becomes a shallow lake on the few days the Tsautsab manages to reach it. Namib Nature Reserve lies along the southern edge of Namibia's Great Sand Sea, where wide horizons make distance feel measurable and calm. Here, space is part of the landscape. In Namib Rand Nature Reserve, Namib Desert, Namibia, pale gravel plains lead into apricot dunes and dark weathered mountains. The light changes quickly, turning ridgelines from copper to muted violet. Dry riverbeds thread through the reserve, usually empty, yet clearly shaped by brief, decisive rains. After a good season, fresh grass can appear in bands, drawing springbok, ostrich, and gemsbok. Plants survive by design rather than abundance. Hardy grasses, low shrubs, and occasional camel thorn that offers small pockets of shade. Even in heat, the air can feel surprisingly clean and still. Tracks tell the quieter stories. Geckos and beetles crossing sand like handwriting, and the soft pad marks of smaller predators near the dunes. In daylight, movement often happens close to the ground. People come for silence as much as scenery, following rough roads that keep the reserve's scale intact. With little artificial light, evening arrives gently and stays. After dark, the reserve's defining feature settles in an uninterrupted night sky, so clear that the Milky Way shows texture, and starlight is bright enough to outline the dunes. Namib Desert stretches along Namibia's Atlantic edge, where wind and time have pared the land down to sand, stone, and open sky. In Namib Desert, Namib region, Namibia, distance feels measurable in silence. Morning often arrives as a cool veil of fog drifting inland from the coast, softening the dunes and beading on sparse grasses. That moisture is brief, but it helps sustain hardy insects and small reptiles that read the sand like a map. Farther inland, the dunes near Sossusvlei shift through shades of rust and apricot as the sun moves, their faces marked by fine ripple lines. A single footprint can last, and then vanish as the next gust redraws the surface. At Deadvlei, pale clay lies cracked under a wide bowl of sand, and blackened camel thorn trees stand where water once pooled. The contrast is stark: bright ground, dark trunks, and dunes that keep their distance like walls. Not far away, Sesrim Canyon cuts into the desert floor, its narrow passages holding cool air and pockets of shade. In a place built on exposure, those sheltered bends feel almost domestic. And when the light settles low, the Namib's most distinctive signature is clear. Towering red dunes with knife-edge crests, sharpened by steady wind and colored by iron-rich sand. Sandwich Harbour sits on Namibia's Atlantic edge, where desert and ocean keep close company. Its shifting shoreline has long been shaped by wind, tide, and drifting sand. In Sandwich Harbour, Namib Naukluft Park, Namibia, the approach is part of the story, often along firm beach sand with waves on one side and steep dune faces on the other. Access depends on local knowledge and careful timing. The bay itself is shallow and changeable, sometimes opening broadly, sometimes tightening into narrow channels. Salt-tolerant plants trace the margins, and the air carries a clean mix of sea spray and mineral dust. Bird life concentrates where the water is calm. Flamingos, pelicans, and smaller waders feeding in the shallows, and their movements add quiet rhythm to a landscape that otherwise feels spare and deliberate. Walvis Bay sits where the Atlantic's cool edge meets the pale sands of the Namib, a working harbour softened by wide, quiet water. In Walvis Bay, Erongo, Namibia, the day often begins with fog drifting in low, turning cranes and moored boats into silhouettes before the light clears. Along the waterfront, salt and diesel mingle with the calls of seabirds, and the town's steady routines feel shaped by tide tables as much as by clocks. Just beyond the streets, the dunes press close, and the landscape can look like one of those impossible places where ocean air cools a desert that never quite retreats. Back at Walvis Bay, the most distinctive sight is the lagoon itself, broad, shallow, and salt-bright, where flamingos feed in still water just steps from the desert. Etosha National Park sits in northern Namibia, a broad reserve where open plains meet a pale basin of salt and dust. In Etosha National Park, Oshikoto region, Namibia, The horizon feels unusually wide even before the animals appear. Life gathers where water lingers. At named waterholes, elephants arrive in measured groups, black rhinos keep to the edges, and springbok move like quick punctuation across the short grass. In the dry season, the park becomes a study in patience. Lions may wait in shade near the last drinkable pools, while jackals circle at a distance, reading the mood of every herd without rushing it. Most travel happens by simple gravel loops between camps and viewing points, with long stretches of quiet driving. After rains, shallow puddles can disguise soft patches and washouts, turning routine routes into dangerous roads for the unprepared. Mopane woodland thickens in places, then opens again to bare, mineral soil. When water spreads across the flats, birds take advantage: plovers, storks, and in good years, flamingos, tracing color along the margins. Near dusk, the park's defining presence is the Etosha Pan itself, a vast, white, salt flat that holds light like a surface, brightening the distance even as the day cools. Pelican Point Lighthouse sits at the far end of a pale sand finger that shelters Walvis Bay from the Atlantic. At Pelican Point Lighthouse, Walvis Bay, Namibia, the air often feels cooler than the desert behind it, softened by sea fog. The tower's steady beam has long helped guide ships past shifting shoals and into the calm, working harbor. On many mornings, the light seems to hang inside the mist, while the surf keeps its own low, even rhythm along the outer beach. Nearby, Cape Fur seals crowd the shoreline in noisy, close-packed colonies, and their tracks braid the dunes. Farther, in the protected water, flamingos and other waders feed in the shallows, where the lagoon concentrates life. Reaching this place means following sandy tracks that demand patience, good tires, and a careful eye for tides, extreme roads, hide-a-planet words that fit the quiet challenge. From here, Walvis Bay's fishing fleet and salt ponds feel close, yet the spit remains spare and exposed. To the north, Namibia's skeleton coast begins to stretch into harsher emptiness, a reminder that these waters can be difficult to read. Wind combs the dunes into fresh lines overnight, and the sea regularly redraws the edge of land. In the end, the defining detail is simple: a narrow ribbon of sand, with open Atlantic on one side and the sheltered bay on the other. Standing by the lighthouse, you can watch both surfaces at once, separated by only a few steps. Cape Cross Seal Reserve sits on Namibia's Atlantic edge, where pale dunes and dark surf share the same horizon. Here at Cape Cross Seal Reserve, Orongo region, Namibia, the Benguela Current keeps the air cool and the water rich with fish. Fog drifts in from the sea and softens the hard lines of the skeleton coast. A short boardwalk carries you above the shoreline, past weathered rocks and patches of wind-toughened coastal plants. Interpretive signs trace the area's human history, from early seafarers to later trading and sealing along this remote coast. Offshore, gulls and cormorants work the upwelling, while jackals patrol the margins with patient caution. Even in bright sun, the soundscape stays busy, barking, splashing, and the steady hush of waves. Isht! Nearby towns such as Swakopmund and the Walvis Bay Lagoon show a different side of the same ocean, shaped by dunes, wind, and salt. Out here, the land feels spare, and life concentrates where the water provides. What stays with you is the colony itself, thousands of Cape Fur seals packed shoulder to shoulder on the black rocks, a living, moving carpet at the waterline. Swakopmund sits where the Atlantic air meets the edge of the Namib, a coastal town with a measured pace and a clear horizon. In Swakopmund, Erongo region, Namibia, the streets still carry traces of early colonial planning alongside everyday Namibian life. Along the mole and the old jetty, anglers and walkers share the same long view, framed by gulls and low surf. Nearby cafes serve strong coffee and fresh pastries while the wind nudges sand into the corners of the promenade. A few blocks inland, tidy facades, small museums, and craft markets make the center easy to explore on foot. When the afternoon light softens, palm-lined lanes and public gardens feel almost unexpectedly calm for a desert-edge town. Solitaire sits quietly on the long gravel links that stitch central Namibia to the Namib. It feels less like a town than a pause in the landscape where the horizon stays wide and unhurried. Along the Namib route, the light shifts from highland clarity to desert haze, and the air carries a faint mineral dryness. Travelers pass through Solitaire, Namib route, Namibia, on the way to dunes near Sossusvlei or the open spaces of the Namib Naukluft Park. The road can be deceptively straight, then suddenly corrugated, the kind of stretch people file away under world-dangerous roads when they talk about fatigue and distance. Here, a simple fuel stop matters as much as water and a moment out of the sun. It's usually easy to find a modest guest house nearby if you plan a night ahead, and mobile coverage tends to be better around the service station than out on the plains. Many travelers pick up a local SIM in larger Namibian towns before heading this way. Around the buildings, wind-blown sand collects in soft drifts, and the desert seems to press close without ever feeling crowded. Even the sounds are spare. An engine cooling, a door latch, a distant bird. What stays with you in Solitaire is the small graveyard of rusting cars beside the road, their faded shells held in place by sand and sun. Keetmanshoop sits where southern Namibia opens into long horizons of scrub, gravel plains, and distant ridge lines. In the town, fuel stops and small markets serve farmers, travelers, and the steady rhythm of the railway. In Keetmanshoop, Karas region, Namibia, dry air sharpens every color: rust-red soil, pale stone, and the bluish shade of camel thorn. The light changes quickly, turning midday glare into soft evening tones. A short drive leads to Nauta Dam, where a narrow ribbon of water draws birds and grazers to the shoreline. Nearby, vineyards and date palms feel unexpected in a landscape defined by dust and wind. Further out, Giant's Playground scatters dolerite boulders into stacked balances and sheltered gaps. It's a place that rewards slow walking, even when extreme roads and washboard tracks insist on patience. Not far away, the Mesosaurus fossil site preserves a time when this ground lay under ancient inland waters. Stone slabs hold delicate traces, inviting careful attention rather than haste. And when the day cools, the quiver tree forest becomes Keetmanshoop's signature. Smooth, pale trunks splitting into forked arms, each crown catching the last low sun above the stony plain. Quiver Tree Forest sits quietly among low granite mounds in Namibia's southern interior, where the land feels open and unhurried. In Quiver Tree Forest, Keetmanshoop, Namibia, the air is often dry enough that even distant sounds seem to travel. The trees here are not true trees, but aloes adapted to long stretches without rain. Their thick, fibrous trunks store moisture, while narrow leaves minimize water loss under bright sun and steady wind. Local Nama communities traditionally used the hollowed branches to make quivers for arrows, a practical solution shaped by what the landscape offered. Nearby, sheep farming and small settlements cluster where water can be managed, but the forest remains largely defined by rock, sky, and hardy life. Yes. Walk between the boulders, and you notice how the granite holds heat late into the day, creating pockets of warmth after sunset. Lichens and small succulents take advantage of tiny cracks, turning a harsh surface into a living map of patience and timing. At dusk, the silhouettes become more intricate, branching into repeated forks that look almost patterned against the open horizon. Photographers often linger because the scene changes subtly as light shifts from white to amber. What stays with you is the quiver tree's pale, papery bark, softly reflecting the last light, while the rest of the stones and soil fall into shadow. Spitzkoppe sits like a weathered landmark on the wide, pale plains of Namibia, its granite surfaces catching the day's changing light with a steady, quiet presence. Here at Spitzkoppe, Erongo region, Namibia, the rock belongs to an ancient story of magma that cooled deep underground, later exposed by time and erosion. Smooth domes and split boulders show how heat, wind, and rare rain keep shaping the stone. In early morning, shadows settle into cracks and bowls, and the granite takes on soft reds and silvers. By afternoon, the same faces look sharper, with dark seams and mica flecks turning into fine, glittering detail. Sheltered overhangs hold sand rock art, small figures and traces of animals set a little back from the glare. These paintings feel close to the land's practical rhythms: travel routes, seasonal water, and watchful hunting. At ground level, the desert is not empty, it's careful. Tough grasses, low shrubs, and the occasional acacia gather around shallow soils, while lizards and insects move between shade patches as the heat shifts. Erongo feels like a wide pause between Namibia's Atlantic fog and its inland heat, where desert plains meet stone. In Erongo region, Namibia, the air often carries fine dust and a clean mineral smell. Along the coast near Swakopmund and Walvis Bay, morning fog slides in low and quiet, feeding lichens that cling to gravel and pale sand. A few hours inland, the light sharpens and the land opens toward ranches, dry riverbeds, and scattered acacias. The towns of Usakos, Karibib, and Omaruru sit in the working middle of the region. with rail lines and roads tying the highlands to the sea. Markets, small gardens, and shade trees hint at water beneath the surface, even when the river is only a wide ribbon of stones. Rock shelters and painted walls hold long records of human movement here, especially around Brandberg, where narrow paths lead into dark gullies and sunlit ledges. In the heat of midday, even a few meters of shade changes what can grow and what can rest. Out on the open flats, oryx and springbok keep to sparse grazing, while tracks stitch the sand between koppies. Nights can turn cool quickly, and the sky feels close enough to read by starlight. Most distinctive of all are Orongo's weathered granite domes and boulder piles, rounded into quiet stacks and corridors. In the late light, the stone holds warmth, and every curve seems patiently worn into place. Fish River Canyon sits in the dry south of Namibia, a broad, ancient cut in the landscape that takes time to understand. From the rim, distance feels measured in layers of rock rather than kilometers. In Fish River Canyon, Karas region, Namibia, light changes quickly, soft at dawn, hard by midday, bringing out reds, browns, and charcoal tones in the cliffs. The air is spare and clean, carrying little sound beyond wind. The canyon's walls expose deep geological time, with hard, folded rock set against younger, straighter bands. Underfoot, gravel and shale remind you that this is a place shaped by slow pressure and rare, powerful floods. Along the rim and down toward the riverbed, desert-adapted life keeps a careful schedule, active in cooler hours and still in the heat. And travelers sometimes group it with impossible places, world-dangerous roads. Yet here, the challenge is often simply the sun and the silence. In nearby settlements across southern Namibia, distances between services are part of daily planning, and the canyon remains a landmark that orients both maps and memory. Even when you leave the viewpoint, its scale lingers. Down on the canyon floor, the Fish River's long, looping bend, sometimes a thin ribbon, sometimes a chain of green-edged pools, draws a single, continuous line through stone. Windhoek sits in a highland basin where dry air keeps the horizon clean and close. In Windhoek, Comas region, Namibia, the pace is measured, shaped by sun, altitude, and wide streets. Independence Avenue carries the city's daily rhythm, past cafes, offices, and jacaranda shade. At Post Street Mall, small meteorites displayed behind glass hint at Namibia's long relationship with stone and sky. Near the center, the Tinton Palace Gardens offer a quiet patch of green, with paths that soften the surrounding government buildings. Close by, The National Museum sites and the old fort structures hold layered stories without needing much ornament. Katatura, markets and barbershops turn ordinary errands into steady conversation and color. Handmade carvings, textiles, and beadwork travel from stall to hand, a local economy built on skill and patience. Damaraland stretches across a wide, quiet corner of northwestern Namibia, where open plains meet weathered hills and long distances are measured in dust and time. In Damaraland, Kunene region, Namibia, dry riverbeds like the Hwab and Ugab cut pale channels through the gravel, carrying water only after rare storms. For most of the year, their sandy floors serve as roads, shade lines, and lifelines. Basalt and granite outcrops break the horizon, and the Brandberg Massif sits apart with a presence that feels older than the roads that circle it. Even in midday heat, the light finds small color changes in the rock: rust, charcoal, and soft gold. Wildlife moves to the rhythm of scarcity, especially where mopane and ana trees mark hidden moisture. Desert-adapted elephants and other animals follow these thin corridors, leaving tracks that vanish quickly under wind. Communities live with the same careful attention to water and grazing, and the landscape carries traces of earlier lives as well. Stone tools, old camps, and worn paths sit close to the surface, easy to miss unless you slow down. At Twyfelfontein, the most distinctive feature is the concentration of ancient rock engravings, rhinos, giraffes, and human figures, cut into flat sandstone panels, still sharp enough to catch the last low light. Bwabwata National Park sits quietly across Namibia's far northeast, where sand meets riverine green in a narrow corridor of protected land. Its boundaries trace old travel routes and seasonal water, shaping a landscape that feels both open and intimate. In Bwabwata National Park, Zambezi region, Namibia, the day often begins with a thin veil of mist over pale grasses and mopane woodland. Light arrives softly, revealing channels, pans, and tracks pressed into the sand by night movement. Elephants drift between shade and water, their paths worn into gentle troughs that guide other animals as well. Buffalo gather in the heavy ranks, and antelope step carefully at the edges, alert to shifting sounds in the reeds. Bird life does much of the talking here. Kingfishers flashing low over the water, herons standing patient in the shallows, and fish eagles calling from tall trees. Even in still moments, wings and water keep the park in motion. Farther from the channels, the ground dries and opens into sandy woodland where heat holds longer into the afternoon. Then, with the next bend of the track, green returns abruptly, stitched to the river's reach. What sets Bwabwata apart is the Kwando River floodplain, a reed-lined ribbon of water and grass that cuts through the park, concentrating life along its cool, shifting edge. Apupa Falls rests along the Kunene River in northern Namibia, where desert light meets a ribbon of permanent water. The sound carries farther than you expect in this open, rocky country. At Apupa Falls, Kunene region, Namibia, the river spreads and breaks into many channels before dropping over dark ledges. In the rainy season, the flow thickens. In drier months, separate streams trace the rock like threads. Makalani palms and fig trees gather near the spray, and their shade draws birds at the hottest hours. Step a little back from the edge, and the vegetation thins quickly into stony slopes and thorny scrub. The Kunene region is home to Himba communities, and nearby paths show how people move between water, grazing, and shelter, even without words. And the landscape explains why a dependable river matters here. Visitors often approach on gravel roads, then finish on foot, following viewpoints along the rim and down toward calmer pools. The air shifts as mist settles on skin and clothes, cooling everything for a moment. What stays with you is the fall's braided shape, a wide fan of separate cascades, stepping over tiered black rock shelves, each stream briefly isolated before joining the river again. Kyokoland settles into Namibia's far northwest with a sense of distance that's measured in gravel roads, dry riverbeds, and wide skies. In Kyokoland, Kunene region, Namibia, the land shifts between stony plains and rust-colored mountains. Around Opuwo, small shops and fuel stops hint at the routes ahead, where cattle paths and track lines often matter as much as maps. Himba homesteads appear quietly along the way, their earth-toned compounds blending into the hillsides. In the Hwanib and Hwarasib River valleys, the channels may be sandy and empty for months, yet they still guide movement across the desert. When seasonal water arrives, it brings fresh green and the chance of seeing desert-adapted elephants following the shade. Travelers usually find simple guest houses in Opuwo or lodges farther north if they book ahead, especially during busy winter weeks. A local SIM or eSIM is useful. Wi-Fi tends to be limited outside towns and often strongest near reception areas. Farther on, the Marienfluss and Hartmann Valley open into long, pale corridors framed by rugged ridgelines. Even in midday heat, the air can feel startlingly clear, as if it's been rinsed clean of haze. Near Apupa, the Kunene River spreads into a broad curtain of falls, threading mist through tall palms and anna trees. That continuous band of water, bright against the dry rock, is Kaokoland's most unmistakable signature. Ruacana Falls sits on the Kunene River in Namibia's far north, where water spreads wide across dark, blocky rock. In the wet months, the flow becomes a dense white sheet, and in drier weeks, it thins to ribbons that reveal the river's rough bed. At Ruacana Falls, Ruacana, Namibia, the air carries a cool, mineral scent, and the sound changes with each bend in the gorge. From the viewing areas, you can trace how the current divides and reunites, shaping small channels before dropping again. This corner of the Kunene region feels open and sunlit, with scrubby vegetation and broad horizons typical of northern Namibia. In late afternoon, the light softens on the cliffs and turns the spray into a faint haze above the waterline. Travel is straightforward here if you plan for distances. It's usually possible to find reasonably priced guest houses in and around Ruacana, and mobile data or an eSIM helps where Wi-Fi is limited. A little extra water and fuel goes a long way on the roads between towns. People often describe Namibia through dunes and deserts, yet this is one of those impossible places where the country's interior suddenly feels aquatic. Even when the river runs lower, the rock keeps its wet sheen in pockets of shade. What stays with you is the fall's unusual breadth, a wide, continuous curtain of water sliding over flat, dark stone ledges, more horizontal than high, stretching across the river in one long line. Kolmanskop Ghost Town sits just inland from Luderitz, where the Namib Desert meets the hard light of Namibia's southern coast. Built for diamond miners, its tidy streets once carried the routines of a short-lived boom. At Kolmanskop Ghost Town, Karas region, Namibia, the layout still reads like a small European-style settlement transplanted to arid ground. Gabled roofs, narrow lanes, and stout walls show how residents tried to make permanence out of distance. In the early 1900s, diamonds drawn from nearby sands funded comforts rare for the desert. A ballroom, a hospital, even leisure spaces meant to soften isolation. Wind and scarcity, however, never stopped pressing at the edges. When mining shifted and people moved on, the town's infrastructure lost its purpose quickly. Paint peeled, window panes cracked, and the steady coastal air carried salt and dust into every corner. Today, visitors walk through rooms where wallpaper patterns and wooden staircases remain surprisingly intact. Outside, the surrounding gravel plains and low dunes keep their own time, guided by wind and fog. The nearby Atlantic influence is felt more than seen, especially in cool mornings when mist hangs low over the desert. That dampness never restores the town. It only sharpens textures: plaster, brick, and sand. Most distinctive are the dunes that have poured through doorways and windows, filling parlors and hallways until furniture lines are replaced by smooth, pale drifts. Brandberg Mountain sits alone on Namibia's western interior, its dark granite catching the light differently at every hour. In Brandberg Mountain, Erongo region, Namibia, the air is dry, but the ground holds stories in stone. From a distance, the massif looks sealed and simple, yet its flanks are cut by ravines that funnel rare runoff. After brief rains, small pools linger in shaded clefts, drawing birds, insects, and the careful tracks of desert-adapted animals. Near the settlement of Oases, gravel roads lead toward the mountain's edges, where local guides read the landscape with practiced calm. The approach passes hardy shrubs and pale grasses that survive between long stretches of sun-baked rock. Walking into the Sisab area, and the temperature shifts as walls close in and shade appears. Footsteps soften on sand and rounded stones, and the silence feels deeper than the open plains. Brandberg is also a library, holding thousands of images painted and etched across shelters and overhangs. For travelers drawn to unseen places, these works turn a hike into a quiet, attentive search. Some panels show animals with careful detail. Others suggest hunting, movement, and ritual. The pigments persist because the rock stays dry, protected by the angle of the overhang and the steadiness of the climate. In the end, the most distinctive feature here is the White Lady painting, small and precise, on a sheltered wall in the Sisab ravine. Even in low light, the pale figure holds its place against the dark granite, and unchanged by the empty air outside. Twyfellfontein sits in a quiet fold of rock, where pale sandstone and dark dolerite share the same horizon. Here in Twyfellfontein, Damaraland, Namibia, the air often carries a dry clarity that makes distance easy to judge and time harder to measure. The valley's shapes were set by ancient rivers and long erosion, leaving shelves, gullies, and smooth faces that catch the sun at different angles. Even in a harsh season, a small spring can linger, drawing attention to the simplest geography: water, shade, and shelter. People have returned to this place for thousands of years, and their presence is recorded without buildings or walls. On the stone, trackers marked what mattered: rhinoceros, giraffe, antelope, and the paths between them, rendered with an economy that suggests practiced hands. Around the wider Damaraland region, desert-adapted wildlife moves with restraint, conserving energy across open ground. In the cooler hours, you can sense how every animal and every person negotiates exposure, choosing routes that follow shadow and stone. By late day, the rock warms into soft color, and the valley quiets except for wind across the rubble. Footsteps crunch lightly, then fade, leaving the surface to do most of the talking. What stays most distinctive at Twyfellfontein is the petroglyph field itself. Hundreds of precise engravings cut into smooth sandstone panels, still readable in the slanting Namibian light. Okonjima Nature Reserve sits in Namibia's central highlands, where broad savanna meets low, rocky hills, and the air carries a dry, clean edge. Here at Okonjima Nature Reserve, Ottjozondjupa region, Namibia, the pace feels measured and unforced. Days begin with dust-soft tracks and the patient work of reading signs, paw prints, scraped earth, a tail mark in sand. Guides pause often, letting silence do part of the explaining. Okonjima is closely linked to the Africat Conservation Program, and that presence shapes what visitors notice. The careful monitoring, the emphasis on distance, the respect for animals that don't perform on cue. On game drives, giraffe and antelope move between thorn bush and open patches while predators keep to shade and cover. And even the reserve's extreme roads feel purposeful, following old game paths and avoiding fragile ground. Between outings, the landscape offers its own quiet detail. Bird calls at first light, the scent of warm grass, and the sudden hush when clouds briefly dim the sun. In this part of Namibia, small changes in light can redraw the scene. Late afternoon settles on Okonjima's sun-warmed granite koppies, where weathered rock holds the day's heat and releases it slowly into the cooling air.